Are you financially abusing your elderly parents? Meadow David, the human resources director at my firm in Bethesda, did not raise his voice. He simply placed a single sheet of printer paper on the polished wood between us. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting a sterile white glow over the text printed on the page. I recognized the sender address instantly. Diane Jones, my own mother. I sat back in the leather chair and kept my hands folded in my lap. I am an actuary. My entire professional existence revolves around calculating risk, predicting mortality, and assigning numerical values to human catastrophe. When the variables turn grim, I do not panic. I adjust the spreadsheet. I picked up the paper. The email detailed a narrative of theft, elder abuse, and coercion. It was neatly formatted with the precise, bloodless syntax my mother honed during her 2 decades as a part-time paralegal. She wrote that I was utilizing my financial expertise to drain her bank accounts. She requested my immediate termination pending a police investigation. She copied my direct supervisor, the head of my department, and the corporate ethics hotline. She was trying to strip me of my career, my reputation, and my livelihood. She wanted to watch me lose the only thing I had built entirely on my own, far away from her reach. And she did it all because I refused to surrender my inheritance to my older sister. I looked David in the eye. I did not cry. I did not defend myself with loud, frantic denials. Hysteria is exactly what my mother was counting on. She wanted me to look erratic, unstable, exactly the way she painted me in her email. Instead, I asked David for a copy of the company policy on external harassment and told him I would return in 10 minutes with my grandmother's death certificate and the contact information for her estate attorney. But sitting in that chair, feeling the chill of the air conditioning against my neck, I realized a fundamental truth about my family. They were no longer just greedy. They were dangerous. Welcome to Morning Revenge, where quiet women share exactly how they balance the books on the people who tried to bankrupt their lives. If you have ever been the reliable daughter who was expected to cover the check for the golden child, this story is for you. Drop your age in the comments below so I know who is listening, and be sure to subscribe. To understand how a 32-year-old woman with a spotless corporate record becomes the subject of an internal investigation, you have to rewind 48 hours. Before the printed email, before the HR meeting, there was a Sunday dinner, a manila folder, and a forced choice. Sunday evening in Annapolis. The dining room of my parents' colonial home smelled of roasted garlic and beeswax polish. My sister Harper sat across from me, twirling a wine glass by its delicate stem. Harper is 3 years older than me, but she has always been the reigning monarch of our household. She is a woman whose perceived fragile genius required constant silent subsidies from the rest of us. She runs a boutique downtown that always seems to be one bad month away from closing, yet she drives a leased European SUV she expects our parents to admire. Dessert had just been cleared. My father, Richard, cleared his throat and placed a thick manila folder next to my coffee cup. "Sign these," he ordered. It was not a request. It was the tone he used when I was a child to stop arguments before they started. I opened the flap. Inside sat a renunciation of property agreement. My mother had drafted it herself, printing it on the heavy stock paper her law firm used for official correspondence. The blank signature line sat at the bottom of the page, waiting for my ink. "Estate taxes are going to eat your grandmother's assets alive if we let this go through standard probate," my father explained. His voice was smooth, practiced, like a man reciting a script he had rehearsed in the mirror. "This document bypasses the red tape. It releases Harper's half of the estate to her directly, today. You can sort out your portion later. If you care about this family, you will do the smart thing." Harper offered a sad, tight smile across the table. "It would really help with the boutique Meadow. I just need a little breathing room right now." I scanned the paragraphs on the page. My actuarial mind requires only seconds to spot bad math. My grandmother's assets sat well below the Maryland estate tax threshold. There was no tax emergency. Furthermore, signing this waiver would not expedite my portion. It would legally waive my right to contest anything they chose to do with the property. It was a blank check dressed up as a family favor. I closed the folder and slid it back across the linen tablecloth. "I do not sign unread legal contracts," I said. My voice matched the temperature of the room. My mother, Diane, stopped wiping the rim of her water glass. She folded her linen napkin into a perfect, sharp square and placed it beside her plate. Her eyes locked onto mine, carrying a cold, calculating weight. "This is not a corporate boardroom, Meadow," she whispered, letting the disappointment drip into every syllable. "This is your family. Your sister deserves a break." "Oh, I almost forgot," my father interjected, ignoring my refusal, as if it were a temporary glitch in his software. "Your mother wants your grandmother's blue recipe book, the old one from the kitchen drawer. Harper wants it for sentimental reasons. You have it, right?" The shift in topic felt jagged, out of place. They were asking for a piece of paper worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in the next breath, asking for a worn-out notebook filled with pie crust instructions. "It is in a box in my trunk," I replied, keeping my posture rigid. "I packed it up when we cleared out her kitchen last week, but I am not signing the waiver tonight." Harper let out a sharp, wounded breath, sinking back into her chair as if I had physically struck her. She looked at our parents with wide, helpless eyes, playing her role to perfection. My father pushed his chair back from the table. The wood scraped loud and harsh against the hardwood floor. He stood tall, pointing a rigid finger toward the front hallway. "If you are going to sit at my table and treat your sister like a parasite, you can leave," he said, his face flushing red, "and do not come back until you are ready to act like part of this family." I did not argue. I did not demand an apology. I picked up my purse, pushed my chair in, and walked toward the front door. I could hear my mother murmuring soft comforts to Harper in the background, a soothing soundtrack to my exile. I left them in their curated dining room, celebrating what they assumed was a temporary delay in their victory. They believed I would return chastised and compliant, ready to trade my future for an invitation back to Sunday dinner. I stepped out onto the driveway. The evening air carried the sharp, salty scent of the Chesapeake Bay. I unlocked my car and climbed into the driver's seat, letting the silence of the cabin wash over me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale under the streetlights. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The screen lit up with a voicemail notification. I pressed play, expecting an angry follow-up lecture from my father. Instead, a dry, gravelly voice filled the car. It was Mr. Sterling, my grandmother's estate attorney. "Meadow," the recording crackled, "I need you, your parents, and your sister in my office tomorrow morning at 9. There has been a development with the will." The morning light filtered through the blinds of my Annapolis apartment, painting sharp geometric lines across the hardwood floor. I stood at the kitchen island, watching the coffee maker drip dark liquid into the glass carafe. The air in the room was still carrying only the faint mechanical hum of the refrigerator. My phone sat face up on the granite counter, the screen illuminated every 30 seconds. The notifications were stacking up in a continuous rhythmic sequence. They originated from a group chat titled Family Updates, a digital gathering space created by my mother years ago to coordinate holiday dinners and share mundane photographs. This morning, it served a different purpose. It was a firing squad. I picked up my mug, letting the ceramic heat warm my palms, and leaned over to read the screen. I did not unlock the phone. I merely watched the preview banners slide across the glass. My father sent the first message at 6 in the morning. He wrote that my behavior at the dinner table was a disgrace to my grandmother's memory. 10 minutes later, my mother added a paragraph dripping with weaponized grief, stating she had not slept a wink because her heart was broken by my selfishness. By 7, the extended family had been activated. Aunt Susan, my mother's younger sister and the family's most reliable conduit for gossip, chimed in. She typed that money changes people, and it was a tragedy to see me prioritize greed over my own blood. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The liquid was bitter and dark. I felt no urge to defend myself. An actuary understands that engaging with bad data only legitimizes the flawed model. Replying to a smear campaign gives the attackers the traction they seek. I simply watched the words appear slide down the screen and vanish into the archive. Then the rhythm broke. A different notification pushed the family chat aside. It was an alert from my credit monitoring application. The banner glowed red, an interface design choice intended to simulate urgency. The text read, "Critical status change on monitored file." I set my mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the granite. I unlocked the phone and opened the application. My thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before I tapped the alert icon. The dashboard loaded, displaying my historically flawless credit score. The number I had spent 12 years protecting was gone. In its place was a figure that indicated financial ruin. I scrolled down to the underlying data. A new derogatory mark had been filed at midnight. It was a final collection notice for a defaulted personal loan. The principal amount was $45,000. The primary borrower listed on the origination document was Harper's Boutique LLC. The secondary guarantor, the cosigner responsible for the default, was Meadow Jones. I stared at the glowing pixels. The digits on the screen remained fixed. $45,000. Arrears over 90 days, sent to third-party collections. My sister had secured a massive commercial loan, defaulted on the payments, and tethered the financial wreckage directly to my Social Security number. The air in my kitchen felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen had been extracted from the room. My mind raced backwards, searching the timeline for the point of intersection. How does a bank issue a $45,000 loan without verifying the cosigner in person? How does a signature materialize on a binding financial contract without my knowledge? The answer arrived with the clarity of a physical blow. The memory transported me back to a humid afternoon in July, 6 months prior. We were sitting on the back patio of my parents' house. The grill was smoking, and my mother was holding court in a wicker chair, wearing a crisp linen blouse and holding a glass of Pinot Grigio. She had recently received a promotion at the real estate law firm where she worked as a part-time paralegal. She took a sip of her wine and laughed, waving her hand dismissively at a story my father was telling about bureaucratic delays at the county clerk office. "You people make things so difficult," she had said, her voice bright with self-importance. "People pay hundreds of dollars and wait weeks for official verification. I just keep my notary stamp in my purse. I bypass all the bureaucracy for our clients. A signature is just ink until I stamp it, then it becomes the law." I stood in my kitchen, the memory fading back into the silence of my apartment. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening precision. My sister needed cash to keep her failing boutique afloat. The bank required a cosigner with pristine credit and verifiable assets. Harper could not ask our parents, as they were already overextended paying the lease on her luxury vehicle. So they used my name. Harper forged my signature on the application, and my mother, the trusted legal professional, used her official brass stamp to notarize the forgery, binding me to the debt under the penalty of law. A lesser person might have collapsed onto the floor. A different daughter might have hurled the phone against the wall, screaming at the betrayal. I walked into my home office and woke up my laptop. Actuaries do not flinch at bad numbers. We analyze them. We isolate the variables, establish the timeline, and calculate the inevitable outcome. I opened a blank spreadsheet. My fingers moved across the keyboard with rapid, methodical strikes. I logged the name of the lending institution. I logged the date of the loan origination. I calculated the 90-day delinquency window, charting the exact month Harper stopped making the payments. As the columns filled with data, the true architecture of last night's dinner revealed itself. The renunciation of property document had nothing to do with estate taxes. It had nothing to do with rewarding the golden child for her supposed brilliance. It was a desperate, panicked cover-up. The collection agency was closing in. The bank was preparing to garnish wages and seize assets. The moment the collection agents contacted me directly, the forgery would be exposed. My parents knew my grandmother possessed significant cash reserves. They needed that cash liquidated and transferred to Harper immediately, before standard probate procedures froze the accounts. If I had signed that waiver last night, Harper would have received the estate funds today. She would have paid off the defaulted loan quietly, closing the account before the collections agency ever knocked on my door. My financial identity would have been salvaged, and I would have spent the rest of my life believing I simply gave up my inheritance for family peace. They did not invite me to dinner to ask for a favor. They invited me to finance their criminal defense without my knowledge. I saved the spreadsheet. I exported a secure copy to a secondary cloud drive. I printed the credit report and the collection notice, the paper warm as it slid from the machine. I placed the documents into a leather folio, my movements precise and deliberate. I walked into my bedroom and changed out of my casual morning clothes. I selected a tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white blouse, and black heels. It was the armor I wore when presenting risk assessments to hostile corporate boards. I checked my watch. It was 8:15 in the morning. Mr. Sterling requested our presence at 9. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door, leaving the quiet sanctuary of my apartment behind. The drive to the law office took 20 minutes. The roads winding through the historic district of Annapolis were slick with morning dew. I kept the radio off, letting the rhythm of the tires rolling over the asphalt fill the silence. My father had told me not to come back until I was ready to act like part of the family. He believed exile would break my resolve. He believed the barrage of toxic messages from Aunt Susan would shame me into submission. They were expecting a fractured, apologetic daughter to walk into that conference room. They expected me to fold under the pressure, sign the waiver in front of the attorney, and surrender the estate to save the family peace. I turned my steering wheel, pulling into the reserved parking lot behind the law firm. The red brick building stood tall against the pale morning sky. My family was sitting in a room right now, believing they had orchestrated a brilliant escape from their own financial ruin. They did not realize the game board had already flipped. They were walking blindly into a legal trap constructed entirely by their own hands, and I was holding the key. The heavy oak door of the law firm stood open. I stepped into the reception area, where the scent of lemon polish and aged paper hung in the air. A receptionist directed me down a long corridor. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor in a steady, measured rhythm. At the end of the hall, the door to the primary conference room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The space was designed to project authority. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany panels lined the walls. An imposing glass table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. A large window offered a view of the sailboats bobbing in the Annapolis harbor, a picturesque backdrop for the grim business of estate settlement. My family had already claimed their seats. My mother, Diane, sat with her spine rigidly straight, wearing a tailored beige suit appropriate for a courtroom. She was organizing her purse with the practiced efficiency of a seasoned legal professional. My father, Richard, leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water. Harper sat next to him, checking her reflection in her phone screen. A heavy gold designer pen twirled endlessly between her manicured fingers.
They looked up as I entered.
Their faces carried a unified expression of smug anticipation. They believed I had arrived to surrender. They assumed the crushing weight of the family group chat and the threat of permanent exile had broken my resolve overnight. They thought I was walking into this room to sign the waiver hand over my inheritance and beg for their forgiveness. I took a seat at the far end of the table, placing my leather folio on the glass surface. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited. Mr. Sterling entered the room a moment later. He was a man in his late 60s, possessing a quiet, meticulous demeanor. He carried a thick manila envelope, the edges worn from handling. He took his seat at the head of the table, adjusting his silver-framed glasses before looking at the assembly. My father decided to take control of the meeting before the attorney could speak. "Thank you for fitting us in, Thomas," my father said, adopting a tone of forced camaraderie. "I know standard probate can take months, but we have an internal family agreement we need you to formalize today. Meadow has agreed to bypass the standard timeline and release Harper's portion of the estate immediately. We brought our own paperwork to expedite the process." My father reached into his briefcase, pulling out the same drafted waiver from the dinner table. He slid it across the glass toward Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling did not look at the document. He placed a wrinkled hand flat on top of his own manila folder. "Richard, that document is irrelevant," the attorney said, his voice even and devoid of judgment. "The previous will, which dictated an equal division of assets between your daughters, is no longer the governing document of this estate." Harper stopped twirling her pen. My mother froze, her hand hovering over the clasp of her purse. "What are you talking about?" my father asked, the false camaraderie vanishing from his voice. "My mother had that will in place for 10 years. "She did," Mr. Sterling agreed, "until 21 days prior to her passing. She requested an urgent meeting at this office. She instructed me to draft a superseding testamentary document. I have called you all here today to read the terms of this finalized, legally binding will." Mr. Sterling opened his envelope. He extracted a crisp stack of papers, the official seal pressed into the top page. The room grew silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above our heads. He cleared his throat and began to read the distribution clause. I hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils. I leave my entire estate, including the primary residence located on Chesapeake Drive, and all liquid assets totaling $850,000 solely and exclusively to my granddaughter Meadow Jones. The gold designer pen slipped from Harper's fingers. It struck the thick glass of the conference table with a sharp, echoing clatter. The sound fractured the silence of the room. The pen rolled off the edge and hit the carpet. No one moved to retrieve it. The color drained from my mother's face, leaving her skin a pale, ashen gray. My father stared at the attorney, his jaw slackening as his brain struggled to process the mathematical reality of the sentence. $850,000. The waterfront property, the cash reserves, all of it belonged to me. Harper let out a high-pitched breath. What does that mean? What about my half? She cannot just leave me with nothing. Mr. Sterling removed his reading glasses and looked directly at my parents. He delivered the facts with the clinical precision of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. Your grandmother requested this change after conducting an audit of her personal finances, the attorney stated. She discovered that her primary emergency fund held at the Regional Credit Union had been systematically depleted over the past 14 months. She was aware of the unauthorized withdrawals. She chose to resolve the theft through her estate planning rather than pressing criminal charges while she was alive. The temperature in the room plummeted. The illusion of my parents' moral superiority shattered in an instant. They believed they had hidden their theft. They thought the dead could not audit a ledger. My mother shifted into her paralegal persona. Her survival instinct overrode her shock. She sat up straight, her voice hardening into a weapon. "This is a fraudulent document," she declared, pointing a shaking finger at the papers. "My mother was 78 years old. She was suffering from cognitive decline. Meadow obviously isolated her and exerted undue influence to have this drafted. I work in estate law, Thomas. You know a judge will throw this out before the ink dries. We will contest this will on the grounds of diminished capacity." I watched her perform. My actuarial mind analyzed her strategy. She was bluffing. She was playing the odds, hoping the threat of a long, expensive legal battle would force me to negotiate a settlement. Mr. Sterling did not blink. He opened a secondary folder on his desk. He extracted a single sheet of paper and slid it across the smooth glass surface toward my mother. "Anticipating that exact response, your mother requested a medical evaluation the morning she signed this will," Mr. Sterling said. "What you are looking at is a sworn affidavit of testamentary capacity. It is signed by 2 independent Maryland neurologists. It confirms she possessed full cognitive function, understood the extent of her assets, and was operating without coercion." My mother stared at the medical signatures. The legal avenue closed. The probability of overturning the will dropped to 0. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The realization settled over my family like a weighted blanket. They had nothing. The estate was gone. The $45,000 fraudulent loan was still ticking down to an explosion. They needed the cash to cover their crimes, and I was the only person holding the vault combination. My father turned his head slowly. He looked at me. The polished veneer of the disappointed parent melted away, revealing the desperate, cornered man underneath. He placed his hands flat on the glass table and leaned forward. His eyes were dark, fixed on mine with a predatory focus. "You think you have won," my father whispered. His voice was a low, grating rasp, devoid of any paternal warmth. "You think you can steal from your own sister and walk away. You have a very comfortable life, Meadow. You have a pristine reputation at that corporate firm of yours. It would be a shame if something happened to it." He tilted his head, letting the threat settle in the air between us. "You are going to fix this," he continued, each word sharp and deliberate. "You are going to sign the property over to Harper by the end of the week, because if you do not, we will take everything you have ever worked for. We will burn your life to the ground." A promise of ruin delivered in a mahogany-paneled room. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother, whose eyes reflected the exact same cold calculation. I looked at Harper, who was staring at me with a mixture of terror and entitlement. I did not offer a response. I did not engage with the threat. I picked up my leather folio, stood up from the chair, and walked out of the room. The echo of Harper's pen hitting the glass still rang in my ears. As I walked to my car, my mind shifted into high gear. They intended to ruin my life. They believed they had the leverage to force my compliance. But they did not know I possessed the collection notice. They did not know I had seen the forged signatures. And they certainly did not know that I was about to dig into the origins of that commercial loan and uncover the real reason my sister was desperate enough to commit a felony. The war had just begun, and they were fighting an actuary. I drove back to my apartment in silence, letting the hum of the engine ground my thoughts. The threat my father delivered in the mahogany conference room echoed in my mind. He promised to burn my life to the ground if I did not sign the estate over to Harper. A normal daughter might have spent the afternoon weeping into a pillow, paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of her own blood. I am not a normal daughter. I'm a professional risk assessor. When an adversary promises to destroy you, the only logical response is to dismantle their arsenal before they can fire the first shot. I walked into my home office and locked the door even though I lived alone. I woke my computer and opened a secure, encrypted folder on my desktop. I named the directory Shadow File. My objective was singular. I needed the anatomy of the $45,000 fraudulent loan. I needed the digital fingerprints my mother left behind when she stamped her seal on a felony. I started by calling the fraud department of the lending institution. Using my Social Security number, I verified my identity and requested the complete origination packet for the commercial debt attached to my name. I informed the representative I was the victim of identity theft and required the metadata associated with the electronic signatures. Within an hour, a secure PDF arrived in my inbox. I opened the document and studied the granular details. The primary applicant was listed as Harper's Boutique, LLC. The secondary guarantor was Meadow Jones. The electronic signatures were time-stamped on a Tuesday afternoon 4 months ago. I scrolled down to the digital footprint. Every online transaction logs the IP address of the device used to submit the forms. I copied the numerical string and ran it through a basic geolocation tracker. The server pinged a residential internet provider. The map zoomed in on a specific latitude and longitude, dropping a digital pin directly on my parents' house in Annapolis. They did not even bother to cover their tracks. They filed the application from their own living room, sitting on the leather sofa, sipping coffee while they chained my financial future to an anchor. But a lingering variable remained unsolved. Harper's Boutique was certainly struggling, but it was a small retail operation. $45,000 is an oddly specific and substantial sum for a minor inventory rescue. Retail failures bleed slowly. This loan was executed in a rush, a sudden injection of capital required immediately. I opened a new tab and accessed the Maryland Judiciary Case Search database. It is a public portal detailing civil and criminal court dockets across the state. I typed my sister's full legal name into the search bar and hit enter. A list of traffic citations populated the screen, followed by a civil lawsuit filed 8 months prior. I clicked on the case number. The plaintiff was Crestview Design Group, a high-end interior architecture firm in Baltimore, where Harper had worked as a procurement manager before suddenly quitting to open her boutique. The cause of action listed on the docket was tortious conversion of corporate funds, embezzlement. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I read the summary of the proceedings. Harper had been manipulating vendor invoices, funneling corporate capital into her own personal accounts to fund her lifestyle. Crestview Design discovered the theft and filed a civil suit threatening to refer the matter to the state prosecutor for criminal indictment if she did not return the stolen funds. The docket showed the civil case was dismissed with prejudice exactly 4 months ago. The dismissal date aligned perfectly with the origination date of the fraudulent loan. The truth hit me with the force of a physical impact. The loan was never for a failing retail business. Harper was being blackmailed by her own actions. She faced actual prison time for felony embezzlement. My parents discovered the theft and realized their golden child was about to become a convicted felon. To pay the quiet restitution settlement and keep Harper out of a jail cell, they needed $45,000. They did not have the cash. So they stole my identity. They framed me for a felony debt to save her from one. I sat back in my desk chair. My chest felt hollow, carved out by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. They did not just ask me to give up my inheritance, they actively sacrificed my freedom and my future to protect a thief. My phone vibrated on the desk, shattering the quiet of the office. The caller ID displayed Harper's name. I let it ring 3 times, regulating my breathing before answering. I pressed the speaker button, keeping my hands free to navigate the court documents on my screen.
Meadow, Harper gasped. Her voice was thin, ragged, punctuated by sharp, wet sobs.
Please do not hang up. I know you are angry about the lawyer's office. I know Dad lost his temper, but you have to help me. I watched the audio waveform bounce on my phone screen. What do you want, Harper? I am at the clinic, she cried, her breathing erratic and frantic. The doctor just came in. They found a mass, Meadow, a localized tumor. They say it is aggressive. I need a specialized surgical intervention, and my insurance is denying the out-of-network provider. They will not schedule the procedure unless I can pay the surgical fee up front. She paused, waiting for the hook to set. When I remained silent, she delivered the numerical demand. I need $30,000 today. If I do not get the surgery, the doctor says it could spread by next month. Please, Meadow, you are my sister. I am begging you for my life. Just transfer the funds from Grandma's account. I will pay you back, I swear. I stared at the court docket proving her history of corporate theft. I looked at the IP log proving her complicity in identity fraud. And now I was listening to her fabricate a lethal medical diagnosis to extort cash directly from my bank account. It was a performance of breathtaking sociopathy. She assumed the threat of my father had softened the ground and her synthetic tears would wash away my boundaries. She believed my empathy was a weakness she could exploit to secure her financial rescue. Which clinic are you at? I asked, my voice flat and clinical. The oncology center downtown, she sobbed the lie, sliding effortlessly through her teeth. Please, just wire the money. I am not sending you a single cent, Harper. The sobbing stopped. The silence on the line was instantaneous, sharp as a blade. The terrified dying sister vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. You are really going to let me drown? Harper said, her tone suddenly dark and steady. You drowned yourself the day you decided to steal, I replied. I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the desk. A profound psychological shift occurred within my mind in that exact moment. For 32 years, I had viewed my family through the lens of traditional loyalty. I operated under the assumption that biological connection carried inherent value. Sitting in my office, surrounded by the paper trail of their crimes, I applied my actuarial training to my own bloodline. In risk management, you calculate the probability of a catastrophic loss. You weigh the cost of maintaining an asset against the potential damage it can inflict upon your portfolio. I stopped calculating the risk of losing my family. I began calculating the devastating cost of keeping them. They were not a support system. They were a terminal liability. They were parasites who would drain my accounts, forge my signature, and fake their own mortality just to avoid the consequences of their actions. By denying Harper the $30,000, I had officially severed the supply line. They were out of options, out of time, and out of cash. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was early afternoon. My father had promised to burn my life to the ground if I did not fix their problem. Since I just refused to pay the ransom, the retaliation was imminent. They knew the only asset I valued as much as my independence was my professional reputation. I closed the shadow file and prepared myself for the incoming strike, unaware that my mother was already drafting an email to the Human Resources Department of my firm, setting the stage for a corporate execution. I stepped out of my sedan, my right hand gripping the cold, heavy cylinder of the newly purchased brass deadbolt. The afternoon heat radiated off the crushed gravel driveway, carrying the sharp scent of the Chesapeake Bay mixed with the dry, dusty odor of baking asphalt. I did not run toward the open front door. Panic is a luxury I do not indulge. I walked with measured, deliberate steps, analyzing the variables of the scene before me. The unfamiliar silver vehicle parked near the garage was a budget rental, easily identifiable by the barcode sticker slapped haphazardly across the rear bumper. My parents had deliberately left their recognizable luxury sport utility vehicles at home. They wanted to slip into this affluent, quiet neighborhood completely undetected. They were operating like thieves in broad daylight, counting on the suburban expectation of privacy to mask their invasion. I crossed the threshold into the foyer, my flat shoes making zero sound against the pristine hardwood floors. The cool, air-conditioned atmosphere inside the house offered absolutely no comfort. The main hallway, previously a pristine corridor lined with my grandmother's antique mirrors, was now completely obstructed. Towering stacks of brown cardboard moving boxes lined the walls. A pile of designer luggage, plastered with airline priority tags, sat near the base of the staircase. They were moving Harper in. I walked further into the living room. My father Richard emerged from the primary bedroom carrying a heavy velvet armchair. My mother Diane trailed right behind him, her arms wrapped around a large stack of folded, expensive clothing. They froze the instant they saw me standing near the fireplace. The sudden halt caused my father to lose his grip on the chair. The wooden legs slammed into the floorboards with a violent, echoing thud. The color drained from my mother's face. She instinctively took a step backward, hiding behind the physical bulk of my father. Richard did not retreat. His surprise lasted only a fraction of a second before his features twisted into a mask of aggressive, entitled fury. He puffed out his chest, stepping over the dropped armchair to close the distance between us. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against the collar of his golf shirt. "You have absolutely no right to be here," my father declared, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. His voice boomed through the empty living room, attempting to dominate the space through sheer volume. I looked at the cardboard boxes, then back to his flushed face. I did not raise my voice to match his yelling. "You are actively trespassing on an estate that legally belongs to me," I stated, my tone remaining entirely flat and clinical. "I am the sole executor. You have exactly 2 minutes to pack up this garbage and remove yourselves from the premises." My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He crossed his arms over his chest, adopting a posture of supreme arrogance. "You think you are so smart because you play with spreadsheets all day," he sneered, taking another step forward until I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "But you do not know a single thing about property law. Probate takes months to close in the state of Maryland. Until a judge bangs a gavel, this house is in a legal gray area. Harper is moving in today. Once she spends the night and receives a piece of mail here, she has established residency." My mother peeked around his shoulder, her eyes flashing with a venomous pride. "We have squatters' rights, Meadow," she hissed, deploying the legal terminology she had undoubtedly researched at her law firm. "You cannot just kick a resident out onto the street. You will have to take us to housing court. It will take you a year to formally evict her, and by that time we will have drained the estate dry fighting you." Their strategy was utterly devious, relying entirely on the slow, grinding bureaucracy of the American legal system. They knew I possessed the deed, but they also knew that local police rarely intervene in family civil disputes once residency is claimed. They were trying to manufacture a tenancy to hold the property hostage. They wanted to force me into a grueling, expensive eviction process, using my grandmother's own house as a weapon to extract the money they desperately needed to pay off Harper's felony embezzlement debt. I did not argue the legal merits of their plan. I did not try to reason with them. I simply reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my car keys. "You are right," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with my father. "Housing court is a nightmare. Evictions take forever. It is a good thing Harper has not spent the night here yet." I pressed my thumb firmly against the red panic button on my key fob. Instantly, the quiet suburban afternoon was shattered. The alarm system on my sedan, parked just outside the open front door, began to scream. The horn blasted in a relentless, piercing, high-decibel rhythm. The headlights and taillights flashed violently, strobing against the large bay windows of the living room. The noise was physically painful, a mechanical shrieking that demanded immediate attention. "What are you doing?" my father yelled, bringing his hands up to cover his ears. "Turn that off." I dropped the keys back into my pocket, leaving the alarm blaring. I took a step toward them, closing the distance. "This is a quiet neighborhood," I yelled over the deafening noise of the car horn. "These are wealthy retirees. They despise noise. I guarantee you 3 different neighbors have already dialed emergency services. The police dispatch response time in this district is under 4 minutes. When the officers arrive, they will find an active home invasion in progress." My mother began to panic. Her entire professional identity rested on a foundation of respectable behavior. She worked for a prestigious real estate law firm. She could not afford to be photographed in handcuffs on a client's front lawn. She could not withstand a police report documenting her attempt to occupy a deceased woman's home. "Richard, we have to go," Diane shrieked, dropping the stack of designer clothes onto the dusty floorboards. "The police cannot find us here. Get in the car right now." The bravado vanished from my father's face. The harsh reality of an impending police confrontation shattered his aggressive facade. He stumbled backward, his polished loafers slipping on the discarded clothing. He turned and sprinted toward the open front door, his heavy footsteps thudding against the wood. My mother followed right behind him, leaving all of Harper's expensive luggage sitting abandoned in the foyer. I followed them onto the front porch, watching as they frantically scrambled into the cheap silver rental car. My father jammed his hand into his pocket wildly, searching for his keys. He yanked his hand out, pulling a tangled mess of metal and plastic. As he ripped his keys from his pocket, a small object dislodged from the cluster. It flew through the humid air and landed silently in the tall, overgrown grass near the edge of the driveway. My father did not notice. He threw himself into the driver's seat, cranked the engine, and slammed the transmission into reverse. The tires spun on the crushed gravel, kicking up a cloud of white dust as the sedan shot backward into the street and sped away, fleeing the neighborhood before the sirens could even begin to echo in the distance. I stood on the porch for a long moment, watching the dust settle. I reached into my pocket and pressed the button to silence my car alarm. The sudden quiet was heavy ringing in my ears. I walked down the wooden steps and approached the edge of the driveway where my father had been standing. I knelt in the thick green grass, parting the blades with my fingers. Resting in the dirt was a single small brass key. It was not a house key. It possessed a unique, elongated shape with a square head and a distinctive numerical sequence stamped into the metal. The logo of a prominent local Maryland financial institution was etched onto the back. I recognized the design instantly from my time auditing banking procedures. It was a bank-issued key for a secure safe deposit box. A chilling realization washed over me. During the reading of the will, Mr. Sterling had mentioned that my grandmother's personal safe deposit box at her primary bank was unaccounted for. She had documented its existence in her financial ledger, but the physical key was completely missing from her personal effects. The attorney assumed it had been lost in the final weeks of her life. It had not been lost. My father had stolen it. He was carrying it in his pocket, keeping it hidden, waiting for an opportunity to access whatever assets my grandmother had locked away. If the box contained cash, jewelry, or bearer bonds, he could have liquidated it without leaving a digital trace, entirely bypassing the probate process. I picked up the brass key. The metal was still warm from his pocket. I curled my fingers around it, feeling the sharp, jagged edges press into my palm. I turned around and walked back inside the house. I closed the heavy oak door and spent the next hour installing the new heavy-duty deadbolts on every entry point. I secured the perimeter, locking my sister's abandoned luggage inside. The physical structure of my grandmother's house was finally impenetrable, but as I stood in the silent foyer, staring down at the small brass object resting in the palm of my hand, the parameters of the conflict fundamentally shifted. My family was entirely focused on real estate and forged loans. They were fighting a war over visible assets, but the most dangerous variables are always the ones left off the balance sheet. Tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into that bank, insert this key into the locking mechanism, and discover exactly what secret my grandmother had hidden from all of us. I woke up on Monday morning before my digital alarm even had the chance to sound. The small brass key rested exactly where I had placed it on my wooden nightstand. It captured the early morning sunlight, casting a sharp metallic reflection against the painted wall. I did not bother making coffee or checking my email. I dressed quietly in a gray tailored skirt and a simple black blouse. I was not dressing for a corporate boardroom today. I was dressing for an evidence extraction. My mind felt incredibly clear, devoid of the emotional fog that usually accompanies family conflict. The events of the previous afternoon on the front lawn had burned away the last lingering remnants of my hesitation. I was no longer dealing with difficult relatives. I was managing hostile adversaries. I arrived at the downtown branch of the Maryland Financial Institution exactly 10 minutes before they unlocked the main doors to the public. I stood alone on the concrete sidewalk watching the uniformed security guard turn the deadbolt on the glass entrance. I walked straight to the customer service desk. I presented the brass key, my government-issued identification, and the legally binding documentation proving I was the sole executor of the estate. The branch manager was a quiet man in a wrinkled suit. He reviewed the paperwork with slow, methodical precision. He checked my identification against his computer screen, nodded silently, picked up a master key from his desk drawer, and escorted me toward the back of the building. The bank vault was a massive steel room, heavy and completely soundproof. The air inside smelled of old paper dust and cold copper. We walked down a narrow, brightly lit aisle lined with hundreds of small metal doors. The manager stopped at a box near the bottom row. He inserted his silver master key into the left keyhole. I stepped forward and slid the brass key my father had dropped in the grass into the right keyhole. We turned them simultaneously. The heavy metal door clicked open with a satisfying mechanical snap. The manager pulled the internal container free, handed it to me, and stepped out of the vault, leaving me entirely alone in the absolute silence. I carried the long, flat metal tin to a private viewing room located just outside the vault doors. The room contained nothing but a small desk and a single rolling chair. I set the heavy tin down on the laminate surface. I took a slow breath and lifted the lid. There were no stacks of $100 bills waiting inside. There were no antique diamond rings, no stock certificates, no bearer bonds. Sitting inside the tin was a single, unremarkable item. It was a notebook. The cover was bound in faded blue fabric, the edges frayed and softened from years of handling. I recognized it instantly. It was the blue recipe book my father had specifically demanded at the Sunday dinner table. He had claimed Harper wanted it for sentimental reasons. He had asked if it was in my trunk, tucked away with the kitchen supplies, feigning casual interest in a piece of family history. I reached into the metal tin and picked up the blue book. It felt dense in my hands. I opened the rigid cover and turned to the first page. The pages were not filled with instructions for baking pies or roasting chickens. The pages were divided into strict geometric columns drawn with a black ballpoint pen. My grandmother had not left me a cookbook. She had left me a comprehensive forensic accounting ledger. I sat down in the chair and began to read. My grandmother was 78 years old when she passed away, and my mother had loudly claimed her mind was failing. That narrative was a convenient lie designed to explain away her financial independence. The handwriting in the book was sharp, precise, and completely lucid. She had documented every single financial transaction my parents had extracted from her over the past decade. It was a masterclass in risk management, executed by a woman who watched her own children steal from her and silently recorded every stolen penny. I traced my finger down the neatly drawn columns: date, amount, justification, actual outcome. My parents had treated her emergency fund like a personal checking account. I found a line item from 3 years ago, $5,000 withdrawn to cover a supposed roof repair at my parents' house. Beside the handwritten entry, my grandmother had taped a small photograph she secretly took of a brand new luxury hot tub sitting on their back patio. She knew. She always knew they were lying. I turned the pages, watching the sums grow progressively larger and the justifications grow increasingly desperate. Then I reached the entries from exactly 4 months ago. The columns detailed the exact timeline of the fraudulent commercial loan. My grandmother had documented a hushed conversation she overheard between my mother and father in her own living room. They were discussing Harper and the corporate embezzlement lawsuit. They were discussing the $45,000 required to keep her out of a federal prison cell. Pinned to the opposite page was a folded sheet of official paper. I carefully unfolded it, spreading it flat against the desk. It was a high-quality photocopy of the original commercial loan application. My grandmother had somehow secured a copy of the paperwork, likely intercepting their mail. The document featured my forged signature, perfectly replicated by my sister. Right below it, preserved in dark black ink, was my mother's official brass notary stamp. This was not just a record of theft. It was physical, undeniable, prosecutable evidence of a felony. My mother had officially notarized a forged document to secure a massive commercial loan, and my grandmother had trapped the proof inside a steel vault, waiting for me to find it. I kept turning the pages, my actuarial brain automatically calculating the running total of the theft. The numbers were staggering. But it was a small, seemingly insignificant entry near the back of the book that finally broke my clinical detachment. The ink on this specific page was slightly smeared, as if the writer had hesitated before pressing the pen to the paper. The date was exactly 1 year ago. The amount was $1,200. The description read, "Canceled physical therapy sessions for the entire month." Next to that entry was a corresponding debit, $1,200 transferred directly into Harper's checking account. The final note explained the transfer was demanded to cover the overdue lease payment on Harper's European crossover vehicle. My chest tightened, a rare physical reaction to raw data. My grandmother had lived with chronic, agonizing joint pain. She had actively sacrificed her own medical care, enduring physical agony in silence so my sister could continue driving a luxury car she did not earn and could not afford. The sheer cruelty of the transaction was breathtaking. I reached the final page of the ledger. My grandmother had calculated the final sum at the bottom of the column. The total amount stolen from her accounts over 10 years was $124,000. I closed the blue ledger. The rough fabric cover scraped gently against my skin. I sat in a silent viewing room staring blankly at the closed door. An actuary assigns value based on verifiable data. For 32 years, I believed my value to my family was based on biological connection, shared history, and mutual affection. I believed I was a daughter and a sister. The blue ledger provided the actual data, correcting my flawed emotional model. I was never a family member to them. I was a disposable asset. I was a pristine credit score they could harvest when their golden child committed a corporate crime. I was a reliable bank account they could drain when their own funds ran dry. And when I finally refused to pay their ransom, they immediately tried to destroy my career and occupy my property. The family dispute was no longer a quiet tragedy playing out in suburban dining rooms. It was a prosecutable criminal offense. I possessed the power to send my mother to a federal penitentiary. I possessed the power to expose my sister to the exact embezzlement charges she had tried so desperately to bury. I placed the blue ledger back into the metal tin, closed the lid securely, and tucked it under my arm. I walked out of the viewing room, returned the empty container to the branch manager, and exited the bank. The late morning sun felt blinding after the dim, artificial lighting of the vault. The downtown street was crowded with pedestrians and city traffic. I walked toward my parked sedan, my mind operating with absolute, terrifying clarity. I unlocked my car door and placed the metal tin carefully on the passenger seat. As I pressed the ignition button to start the engine, my cell phone began to ring loudly through the vehicle audio system. I glanced at the digital dashboard display. The incoming caller was Aunt Susan. She was my mother's younger sister, the exact woman who had filled the family group chat with toxic messages about my supposed greed just 48 hours ago. I let it ring 3 times, analyzing the probability of another ambush before I pressed the button to accept the call. Her voice flooded the quiet cabin of the car. She did not sound angry or self-righteous. She sounded frantic, deploying a tone of hushed, desperate secrecy. "Meadow, you need to meet me right now," she whispered rapidly into the receiver, her breath catching in her throat. "I am at the coffee shop on Main Street. Your parents are planning something massive, and if you do not listen to me, you are going to lose everything." I did not immediately drive to the coffee shop. When dealing with a hostile coordinated network, an actuary never enters a secondary location without first securing their data. I pulled my sedan into the parking lot of a commercial print center on the outskirts of Annapolis. I carried the metal tin inside, rented a private computer terminal, and spent 30 minutes scanning every single page of the blue ledger into a high-resolution digital file. I encrypted the folder and uploaded it directly to my secure cloud server. The physical book was now backed up by an indestructible digital twin. Before ending my session, I printed a single specific page from the digital archive. I folded the warm piece of printer paper into perfect thirds, slipped it into the inner pocket of my blazer, and returned to my car. Only then did I input the Bethesda address into my navigation system. The drive took 45 minutes. The location Aunt Susan had selected was a bustling, high-end espresso bar situated in the center of a wealthy commercial district. It featured polished concrete floors, exposed steel ductwork, and an ambient noise level consisting of grinding coffee beans and loud, overlapping conversations. It was a highly public arena. My aunt had not chosen this venue for a quiet family discussion. She had chosen it to execute a public shaming. I located Susan sitting at a small circular table near the center of the room. She was wearing a bright, aggressive yellow blouse, her posture rigidly upright. Susan is my mother's younger sister. For her entire adult life, she has functioned as the family megaphone. She thrives on manufactured drama, operating as a willing proxy for my mother's continuous campaigns of social control. In psychological terminology, she is a flying monkey, a secondary aggressor deployed by a narcissist to harass a designated target. I approached the table and took the metal chair opposite her. A barista immediately approached and placed a standard black drip coffee in front of me, a courtesy beverage Susan had clearly ordered in advance to anchor me to the table. Susan did not offer a greeting. She leaned forward, placing her elbows aggressively on the surface of the table. "Your mother is experiencing severe heart palpitations," Meadow Susan declared. Her voice was deliberately elevated, designed to cut through the ambient noise of the cafe. She had not slept in 3 days. "You are physically destroying her health with this absurd, selfish vendetta." I did not reply. I reached out and picked up a silver spoon resting on a nearby napkin. "You think you are so clever locking them out of that house," Susan continued, her volume increasing with every sentence. Her eyes darted rapidly to the left and right, checking to see if the surrounding patrons were tuning into the spectacle. "They are your parents. They gave you everything, and now you are driving them into absolute bankruptcy over a piece of real estate you do not even need. Harper is terrified. Your father is talking about liquidating his retirement accounts just to survive the week. How can you sit there and be so incredibly greedy?" The woman at the adjacent table stopped typing on her laptop, her gaze drifting toward our conversation. A man standing in the pickup line turned his head, his brow furrowed in judgment. This was the boulder Susan intended to drop on my chest. She was weaponizing public embarrassment, assuming my corporate discipline nature would compel me to surrender, simply to stop the humiliating scene. I remained entirely motionless. My face did not flush, my breathing did not accelerate. I simply placed the silver spoon into my black coffee and began to stir. The metal scraped against the ceramic mug in a slow, rhythmic circle. Clink, clink, clink. I maintained unblinking eye contact with my aunt, letting the absolute silence of my response absorb her kinetic energy. The longer I said nothing, the more unsettled she became. Her righteous momentum began to falter. She shifted her weight in the chair, her bright yellow blouse rustling awkwardly. She opened her mouth to launch another volley of accusations, but the words caught in her throat. She had expected a defensive, tearful argument. She had no protocol for a target who simply watched her perform. "Are you entirely finished, Susan?" I asked. My voice was a flat, clinical baseline. I did not project my words. I forced her to lean in to hear me. She swallowed hard, suddenly, aware of the awkward silence she had created in our corner of the room. "I am trying to save your relationship with your family," she whispered defensively. "You do not have a family," I corrected her, keeping my tone perfectly even. "You have a sister who views you as a gullible, disposable asset." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. I withdrew the folded photocopy, flattened the creases against the edge of the table, and slid the paper across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of her hands. "Read the third column from the top," I instructed. Susan looked down at the paper, her brow knitting together in confusion. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the distinct, elegant cursive of her own mother. Her eyes scanned the ink. The date on the line item was exactly 2 years ago. The withdrawal amount listed was $8,000. The description recorded by my grandmother read, "Emergency medical funds extracted by Diane." Susan looked up, her expression a mixture of confusion and lingering defiance. "So what?" she scoffed. "Your mother needed help with medical bills. Keep reading," I commanded. "Look at the column to the right. Look at the actual destination of the funds." Susan lowered her eyes back to the page. Her grandmother had meticulously taped a printed digital receipt next to the entry. It was an email confirmation from a luxury travel agency. The $8,000 had not gone to a hospital. It had purchased 2 first-class airline tickets and a 7-day all-inclusive stay at a 5-star oceanfront resort in Cabo San Lucas. The names on the travel itinerary were Diane Jones and Harper Jones. I watched the exact moment the truth detonated inside Susan's mind. I remembered that specific vacation vividly. Susan remembered it too. Diane had paraded hundreds of photographs across social media bragging to the entire family that Harper's boutique was so wildly successful that her oldest daughter had treated her to a lavish tropical getaway. Susan had been bitterly jealous of that trip. Diane did not steal that money from my grandmother, I explained, keeping my voice devoid of empathy. She stole that money from your mother. While your mother was sitting in her house rationing her own physical therapy appointments to save cash, Diane was drinking margaritas on a Mexican beach using the emergency medical fund. The righteous anger completely drained from Susan's face. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her skin a mottled, sickly gray. Her hands began to tremble. The paper rattled violently against the surface of the table. "This cannot be real," Susan gasped, her voice fractured and breathless. "She told me Harper paid for that trip. She told me the boutique was generating massive profits." "Harper's boutique has been insolvent for 2 years," I stated, systematically dismantling the false reality she had inhabited. 4 months ago, Harper was sued for corporate embezzlement by her former employer. She faced a criminal indictment. To pay the secret restitution and keep your precious niece out of a federal penitentiary, your sister and brother-in-law needed $45,000 in untraceable cash. Susan stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the ambient noise of the cafe completely fading into the background. "They forged my signature on a commercial loan application," I continued, driving the final nail into the coffin of her loyalty. Diane used her official brass paralegal stamp to illegally notarize the forged documents. They committed a coordinated felony, framed me for the massive debt, and then attempted to steal the entire estate to cover their tracks. When I refused to surrender my inheritance, Diane called the human resources director at my firm and tried to have me fired for elder abuse. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over our table. Susan was a woman who lived for gossip, but she was entirely unequipped to process a verified criminal conspiracy engineered by her own sister. She had spent the last 48 hours aggressively harassing me on behalf of the very people who had financially abused her mother and committed identity theft. She realized with crushing clarity that she was nothing more than a pawn on Diane's board. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I reached into my purse, extracted a crisp $5 bill, and dropped it onto the table to cover the cost of the untouched black coffee. "You can keep the photocopy, Susan," I said, looking down at her trembling frame. "I highly recommend you stop lecturing me about family loyalty and start asking your sister why she is perfectly comfortable letting you defend a felony." I turned my back on her and walked out of the coffee shop. The heavy glass door swung shut behind me, severing the connection to the cafe. The afternoon air felt incredibly clean. I walked the 2 blocks back to the paid parking garage with a steady, rhythmic stride. I reached my sedan, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. As I pressed the ignition button, the digital screen on my dashboard illuminated. My cell phone, resting in the center console, suddenly began to vibrate. It was not a single notification. It was a rapid, unending sequence of aggressive digital strikes. The phone buzzed so violently it rattled against the plastic cup holder. I glanced at the screen. The notifications were flooding in from the Family Updates group chat. Susan had not waited to process her grief privately. She had immediately weaponized the photocopy. I watched the text previews flash across the glass. Susan had uploaded a photograph of the ledger page directly into the group chat, tagging every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in the family network. She followed the image with a massive, blistering paragraph accusing Diane of robbing their dying mother to fund Harper's fake lifestyle. The protective echo chamber my parents had meticulously constructed was officially shattered. They were completely exposed to the entire extended family. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the garage, knowing my mother was currently staring at her phone in absolute horror, realizing the quiet daughter she had tried to destroy had just launched a catastrophic counteroffensive. The digital fallout from Aunt Susan uploading the ledger page into the family network was instantaneous and catastrophic. As I drove away from the parking garage, my cell phone screen became a continuous blur of incoming text messages and missed call alerts. I ignored all of them, keeping my eyes fixed on the heavy afternoon traffic winding through Bethesda. The protective echo chamber my parents had meticulously maintained for decades was collapsing in real time. I anticipated a period of stunned silence from them as they scrambled to contain the social damage. I miscalculated their capacity for delusion. 20 minutes into my drive, the phone stopped vibrating with text notifications and began to ring with an incoming voice call. The caller identification displayed my father's cell phone number. I did not answer. I allowed the digital assistant to route him directly to voicemail. A moment later, a small icon appeared on my screen indicating a recorded audio message was waiting. I tapped the icon, piping the audio through the speakers of my sedan. My father did not sound panicked about the group chat exposure. He sounded remarkably smug, his voice dripping with a manufactured, triumphant confidence. Meadow, he began adopting the patronizing tone he usually reserved for uneducated service workers. I understand you are throwing a childish tantrum with your aunt right now, but it does not matter anymore. While we were packing up Harper's belongings this afternoon, we found something. Your grandmother hid a newer will under the floorboards in the primary bedroom. It supersedes whatever garbage you manipulated her into signing. This one leaves the entire estate to Harper. We are bringing it to Thomas Sterling tomorrow morning. You can pack up your new locks and walk away. I listened to the recording a second time, analyzing the vocal cadence and the underlying logic. It was a pathetic, transparent bluff. An actuary understands that desperate people often deploy red herrings to distract their opponents from the actual threat. The claim was structurally absurd. My grandmother did not possess the physical mobility to pry up hardwood floorboards. Furthermore, valid testamentary documents required the signatures of 2 independent witnesses to carry any legal weight in the state of Maryland. A secret letter hidden in the dust is completely useless in a probate court. My father was trying to induce panic. He wanted me to scramble, to feel cornered, to exhaust my mental energy worrying about a phantom document. I deleted the voicemail. However, the true escalation arrived precisely 1 hour later. I had just returned to my apartment and placed my keys on the granite kitchen counter when my phone rang again. This time, the caller was Thomas Sterling, the estate attorney. "Meadow, you need to return to my office immediately," the lawyer stated. His normally composed voice sounded strained, frayed around the edges. "Your mother just bypassed my receptionist and dropped a physical document directly onto my desk. It is not a new will, it is a property transfer. I did not ask questions over the phone. I changed my shoes, walked back out the door, and drove straight to the law firm." When I entered the mahogany-paneled conference room for the second time in 2 days, Thomas Sterling was standing by the large glass window, massaging his temples. He pointed to a single sheet of heavy stock paper resting in the center of the table. I approached the glass surface and looked down. It was a quitclaim deed. In real estate law, a quitclaim deed is a blunt instrument. It transfers any ownership interest a person holds in a property directly to another party, bypassing standard title guarantees. It is frequently utilized in rapid internal family property transfers. This specific document claimed to transfer the entire ownership of the Chesapeake Drive waterfront property from my grandmother directly to Harper Jones. It was completely filled out, signed, and officially notarized. I checked the execution date printed at the top of the page. It was backdated exactly 14 months ago. Your mother claims she found this in your grandmother's personal files. Thomas explained, returning to his leather chair and sinking into the upholstery. She insists the property was legally transferred to Harper over a year prior to the death. If this document is valid, the house is completely removed from the probate estate. It belongs to your sister effective immediately. I leaned closer, inspecting the ink on the page. My grandmother possessed an elegant, sweeping, Palmer method cursive, honed from decades of handwritten correspondence. The signature scrawled at the bottom of this quitclaim deed was a grotesque, amateurish forgery. The letters were jerky and forced, lacking the fluid pressure variation of a natural signature. The loops on the vowels were entirely wrong, mirroring the exact penmanship Harper had used when she forged my name on her fraudulent commercial loan application. And resting directly beneath that pathetic imitation was the official raised brass seal of Diane Jones, registered Maryland Notary Public. My mother had not just forged a document, she had officially certified a fabricated real estate transfer under the penalty of perjury. The strategy clicked into place with horrifying clarity. She knew the signature would never survive a professional forensic handwriting analysis, but she also knew that challenging a recorded quitclaim deed in civil court is a grueling, agonizingly slow process. It would require me to hire a dedicated litigation attorney, pay tens of thousands of dollars in retainer fees, and spend the next 2 years fighting them in front of a judge. She was banking on my analytical nature. She assumed I would perform a cost-benefit analysis, look at the immense financial and emotional toll of a protracted legal war, and simply surrender the house to avoid the nightmare. She believed she could exhaust me into submission. They were not just greedy anymore, they were catastrophically reckless. They were willing to burn down the entire legal system just to protect themselves from the consequences of their own financial failures. Thomas watched me carefully from across the table. "What do you want to do, Meadow? We can file an emergency injunction to block the recording of the deed, but it will be expensive." I did not answer him immediately. I stared at the forged ink on the page and a profound, heavy silence settled over my mind. For the past 3 days, I had operated entirely on defense. I had gathered evidence, secured the property, and protected my own professional reputation. But looking at the backdated deed, I realized passive protection was no longer mathematically viable. You cannot negotiate with a machine designed to destroy you. You must dismantle the machinery entirely. I looked at the attorney. "Keep the original document in your secure safe, Thomas. Do not file the injunction." He furrowed his brow, deeply confused by my instruction. "If we do not fight this in civil court, they will take the house." "We are not going to civil court," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of warmth. "I am taking this out of your jurisdiction." I left the law office and walked back to my sedan. I climbed into the driver's seat, closed the door, and locked it. The afternoon sun baked the interior of the car, but I felt completely numb. I gripped the steering wheel and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to process the psychological threshold I was about to cross. An actuary deals with cold numbers, but the people attempting to destroy my life were the same people who had taught me how to read. They had purchased my childhood bicycles. They had clapped at my college graduation. A heavy, suffocating grief washed over me, a mourning for the parents I thought I possessed, and a crushing acceptance of the criminals they actually were. I let the tears fall hot and silent, mapping the destruction of my fundamental family unit. When the digital clock on my dashboard indicated 5 minutes had passed, I wiped my face with a tissue. I regulated my breathing, pulling the clinical, emotionless armor back over my shoulders. The grieving process was officially concluded. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line for the Maryland State Police, navigating the automated menu until I was connected to the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. The phone clicked and a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Detective Miller, Fraud Division." "Detective," I stated, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "I need to schedule an immediate appointment to file a comprehensive criminal report regarding a coordinated identity theft, elder financial abuse, and a fraudulent real estate conveyance involving a registered state notary." The detective paused the typing on his keyboard, suddenly stopping. "That is a substantial list of allegations, ma'am. Do you possess physical evidence to support these claims?" "I have a handwritten accounting ledger detailing $124,000 in stolen funds," I replied methodically. "I have the IP address logs for a forged commercial loan application, and I currently have a backdated quitclaim deed featuring a fabricated signature." I could hear the scratch of a pen on paper as the detective began taking rigorous notes. "Can you provide the name of the notary who stamped the real estate transfer?" "Her name is Diane Jones," I answered. The detective typed the name into his database. There was a long, heavy silence on the line, stretching for several agonizing seconds. "Ma'am," the detective finally said, his voice entirely devoid of its previous routine boredom, "can you read me the commission registration number stamped on that deed?" I retrieved the high-resolution photograph of the deed I had taken in the law office and read the 7-digit string of numbers aloud. The detective exhaled sharply into the receiver. "Miss Jones," he said, adopting a tone of sudden, intense urgency, "I am dispatching a patrol unit to secure that physical document from your attorney right now. The notary commission number you just provided does not belong to a valid legal professional. That specific license was permanently revoked by the State Ethics Board 3 years ago for gross misconduct. Every single document your mother has stamped since then constitutes a direct federal offense." The interrogation room at the Maryland State Police Barracks was an exercise in institutional deprivation. The walls were painted a flat, non-reflective gray. The air conditioning rattled through a rusted metal vent near the ceiling, smelling faintly of ammonia floor cleaner and ozone from the aging copy machines down the hall. I sat in a rigid plastic chair opposite Detective Miller. He was a veteran investigator with deep creases around his eyes and a graying mustache, a man who had clearly spent decades navigating the chaotic, emotional wreckage of domestic disputes. He did not expect the meticulous, categorized presentation resting on his scratched metal desk. I had arranged the physical evidence into 4 distinct quadrants. The first contained the high-resolution printed logs detailing the IP addresses used to submit the forged commercial loan application. The second held the digital scan of the backdated quitclaim deed. The third quadrant displayed the medical affidavit proving my grandmother possessed full cognitive capacity. The final quadrant was occupied by the faded fabric cover of the blue accounting ledger, its pages bookmarked with colored adhesive tabs corresponding to the exact dates of the financial thefts. Detective Miller spent 45 minutes reviewing the materials in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the heavy scrape of paper sliding across the metal surface and the rhythmic clicking of his ballpoint pen. When he finally finished, he closed the blue ledger and leaned back in his chair. He looked at me, his professional demeanor shifting from routine boredom to grim, focused intensity. The machinery of justice is notoriously slow, but when it is fed a diet of absolute verified data, it grinds to life with terrifying speed. Miller began to list the inevitable consequences of my parents' actions, stacking the charges like heavy stones. He confirmed that forging my signature to secure a $45,000 commercial loan constituted felony identity theft, but the escalation did not stop at the state level. Because the lending institution they defrauded was headquartered in Delaware, the electronic transmission of the forged application crossed state lines. That specific geographic detail elevated the crime to federal wire fraud. He pointed his pen at the copy of the quitclaim deed. He stated that attempting to record a fabricated real estate transfer was a severe property crime. But the most catastrophic variable was the brass seal pressed into the bottom of the page. By acting as an official notary public 3 years after her commission was permanently revoked by the State Ethics Board, my mother had committed systemic perjury. Every single legal document she had stamped since her disbarment was now inherently compromised. She had not merely broken the law, she had poisoned the well of the county clerk office. "This is no longer a civil dispute over an inheritance," Miller explained, his voice low and serious. "You are looking at a multi-agency criminal investigation. Your mother is facing state forgery charges and federal fraud indictments. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for this combination of offenses ensure she will serve significant time in a penitentiary." He reached across the desk and gently pushed a square cardboard box of tissues toward my hands. It was a small, reflexive gesture born from years of watching families shatter inside this very room. He assumed the crushing reality of sending my own mother to prison would break my clinical exterior. He expected the tears to fall. He waited for the inevitable hysterical bargaining that occurs when a victim realizes the permanence of the criminal justice system. I looked at the white paper squares protruding from the cardboard box. I did not reach for them. Instead, I picked up the small plastic cup of water sitting next to my evidence folders. I took a slow, measured sip. The cold liquid grounded my thoughts, keeping my heart rate perfectly steady. An actuary does not cry over the inevitable conclusion of a flawed equation. My parents had calculated the risk of destroying my life, and they had decided the potential financial reward was worth the gamble. I was simply returning their investment. I set the cup down and asked the detective for his immediate tactical timeline. Miller retracted the tissue box, his expression reflecting a sudden, profound respect for my detachment. He informed me he was walking directly to a district judge to secure an immediate subpoena. The target was Diane's official notary logbook. State law requires every registered notary to maintain a bound physical journal recording the chronological details of every document they stamp. If she failed to record the forged real estate deed, it constituted a secondary cover-up crime. If she had falsified the entry, it proved premeditated criminal intent. 2 uniformed state troopers were being dispatched to the Annapolis house to execute the warrant and seize the journal before my mother could destroy it. I left the precinct through the heavy glass double doors and drove back to my apartment. The late afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the highway. I assumed I would have to wait several days to learn the outcome of the police raid. I underestimated the efficiency of the family surveillance network. Just after 6 o'clock in the evening, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen island. The caller identification displayed Aunt Susan's name. I accepted the call and pressed the speaker icon, letting her frantic, breathless voice fill the quiet space of my kitchen. Susan had not recovered from the revelation at the coffee shop. Driven by a volatile mixture of betrayal and morbid curiosity, she had driven to my parents' neighborhood to confront Diane about the stolen vacation funds. She had parked her car under a large oak tree 2 houses down from the property, preparing her argument. Instead of marching up to the front door, she found herself with a front row seat to the exact moment the firewall collapsed.
"Meadow, they are here," Susan whispered into the receiver, the audio crackling with static. "2 marked police cruisers just blocked your parents' driveway. The officers are standing on the front porch right now. Your father looks like he is going to have a heart attack."
I listened in silence as Susan provided a real-time audio feed of the destruction. She described the troopers handing my mother a folded legal document. She described the sheer panic radiating from Diane as the officers stepped past the threshold and entered the colonial home. But the most critical piece of data did not involve my parents. It involved my sister. Harper had been lounging on the front lawn, attempting to tan in the fading sunlight, entirely oblivious to the incoming threat. When she saw the state police demand entry, she realized they were not responding to a neighborhood noise complaint. They were executing a financial crimes warrant. In that precise moment, Harper understood that the protective bubble her parents had maintained for 35 years was officially ruptured. They could no longer shield her from the consequences of her corporate embezzlement. They could no longer absorb her debts. The massive federal fraud they had committed to save her was now dragging all of them down into the abyss. Susan described the confrontation echoing across the manicured suburban lawns. Harper did not rush to her parents' defense. She did not offer comfort. A parasite possesses absolutely no loyalty to a dying host. Harper began screaming at your mother, Susan reported, her voice trembling with shock. She was completely hysterical. She yelled that they promised to fix the debt. She screamed that they swore Meadow was going to take the fall for the loan. She looked right at your father and told him she was not going to a federal prison because he was too stupid to forge the paperwork correctly. Harper had turned on them the second the risk outweighed the reward. She publicly implicated them in the conspiracy, screaming her confession into the open air, while the state troopers stood in the hallway, listening to every single word. I ended the call with Susan and left the phone on the counter. The house of cards had not just fallen, it had incinerated. I slept soundly that night, enjoying 8 unbroken hours of deep, restorative rest. The next morning, the legal landscape shifted again. I was pouring my first cup of coffee when the phone rang. It was Thomas Sterling, the estate attorney. His normally measured cadence was tight-clipped with professional frustration. "Meadow, the situation has escalated," Thomas announced. "Your parents did not wait for the police to finish their search. They immediately retained the services of a highly aggressive criminal defense firm in Baltimore." I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the heat radiate through the ceramic mug. Retaining legal counsel is a standard variable for guilty parties. It changes nothing about the physical evidence currently sitting in a police evidence locker. "It changes their immediate strategy," Thomas countered. "The defense attorney just contacted my office. They are demanding a final, formal mediation session tomorrow morning in my conference room. They are proposing a global settlement. They want to put everything on the table to resolve this dispute internally." I stared out the kitchen window, watching a pair of birds fighting over a branch in the oak tree outside. My parents were suffering from a terminal case of arrogance. They still believed they were operating in a corporate environment. They thought a federal criminal indictment was simply a high-stakes negotiation tactic. They believed that if they hired a shark attorney and applied maximum pressure in a closed room, they could bully me into recanting my testimony. They wanted to force me to refuse cooperation with Detective Miller, hoping to starve the prosecution of its primary witness. They thought they could buy their way out of a felony. Do not attend this meeting, Meadow Thomas advised. It is an intimidation tactic. You have absolutely no legal obligation to sit in a room with the people who stole your identity. Let the police handle the communication. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. The ceramic made a sharp, decisive click. I had spent my entire life avoiding conflict, quietly absorbing their demands to maintain the peace. I had allowed them to dictate the terms of our relationship from the very beginning. But the power dynamic had completely inverted. They were desperate, cornered, and bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. "Schedule the mediation for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, Thomas E., instructed my voice, echoing with absolute clinical authority. I am not going to negotiate a settlement. I am going to walk into that room and watch them realize they have absolutely nothing left to trade. The elevator doors opened to the top floor of the most expensive legal firm in downtown Annapolis. The reception area was an expansive display of wealth, featuring imported marble floors and a panoramic view of the harbor. Thomas Sterling walked beside me, his briefcase held firmly in his right hand. He was accustomed to the subdued, historical elegance of his own workspace. The environment we were entering was deliberately designed to intimidate. It was a corporate fortress, built to remind opposing parties that they were financially outmatched. We were guided into a massive conference room with walls made entirely of soundproof glass. The long mahogany table was already occupied. My father Richard sat rigidly in an oversized leather chair. His posture was aggressive, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the severe lack of sleep. My mother Diane sat next to him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was wearing her standard professional armor, a tailored navy suit, but her skin had a sallow gray quality that expensive cosmetics could not hide. Harper sat at the far end of their side of the table. She looked terrified, her eyes darting nervously around the room. And sitting squarely in the center of their defensive line was the man they had hired to save them from a federal prison sentence. His name was Marcus Vance. He was a high-profile criminal defense attorney, known for representing wealthy clients accused of white-collar crimes. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and a gold watch that likely cost more than my first vehicle. He leaned back in his chair, projecting an aura of supreme, unbothered confidence. Thomas and I took our seats on the opposite side of the mahogany table. I placed my black leather briefcase on the floor directly next to my feet. Marcus Vance did not bother with pleasantries. He did not offer a handshake or a formal introduction. He simply opened a thick legal file on the table and began his opening monologue. "We are here to resolve a minor family misunderstanding," Vance declared, his voice smooth and heavily practiced. He spoke as if the state police had not just raided his client's home 24 hours prior. "This entire situation has escalated unnecessarily due to heightened emotional distress following a death in the family. My clients are prepared to offer a generous global settlement today to prevent this from entering the public record." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood surface. I did not interrupt him. I allowed him to lay out the parameters of their delusion. "Your grandmother suffered from documented periods of confusion in her final months," Vance continued, weaving the fabricated narrative my mother had undoubtedly fed him. "The superseding will you produced is highly vulnerable to a competency challenge. The backdated quitclaim deed my client discovered, however, is a legally notarized document. If we take this to civil court, it will trigger a probate freeze." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, attempting to shrink the physical distance between us. "A civil litigation battle of this magnitude will take minimum 3 years to resolve," Vance warned, dropping the massive conflict onto the table. "The legal fees will completely drain the liquid assets of the estate. The house will sit empty and decay. Nobody wins a war of attrition, but my clients love their daughter. They are willing to overlook your aggressive tactics. If you agree to a 50-50 split of all estate assets and immediately withdraw your baseless police complaint regarding the commercial loan, we will drop our claim to the property. You sign the settlement today, and everyone walks away whole." It was a masterful performance of legal extortion. He was threatening to burn the estate to the ground through endless bureaucratic delays if I did not pay the ransom. My parents watched me intently from across the table, their faces tight with desperate anticipation. They still believed I was the quiet, compliant daughter. They assumed the overwhelming pressure of a high-powered defense attorney and the threat of a grueling 3-year court battle would force me to fold. They thought I would prioritize peace over justice. I did not look at the attorney. I shifted my gaze to my older sister. Harper was staring down at her lap. Her right hand rested on the edge of the mahogany table holding her cell phone. Her index finger was tapping the edge of the device against the wood in a rapid, erratic rhythm. The sound was faint but distinct against the heavy silence of the room. That nervous tell was a tiny variable dropping into a quiet equation. Harper only tapped her phone when she knew she was trapped in a lie she could not escape. I had seen her do it when we were teenagers and she was caught stealing money from our mother's purse. I had seen her do it at the Sunday dinner table when she falsely claimed she needed a loan for her failing boutique. The tapping proved she knew the absolute truth. She knew the defense attorney was bluffing on their behalf. She knew their entire legal strategy was constructed on a foundation of deliberate fraud. I looked back at my parents. I evaluated their emotional debt the exact same way I evaluate mortality risk on an actuarial table. My father was gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. My mother was deliberately avoiding eye contact with Thomas Sterling, the exact man who knew her notary commission had been permanently revoked. They were putting on a performance of dominant strength, but underneath the expensive suits and the hired legal muscle, they were fundamentally bankrupt. They had drained my grandmother of $124,000. They had framed me for a $45,000 commercial default. They had attempted to destroy my professional career and steal my property. And now they wanted me to hand over half of my inheritance to protect them from the consequences of their own reckless actions. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost suffocating. Marcus Vance sat across from me, radiating smug superiority. He believed he held all the leverage because he specialized in intimidating civilian plaintiffs with the threat of endless civil lawsuits. He thought he was playing a game of chess against a frightened amateur. He was completely unaware that we were not playing a game at all. Vance had threatened me with a 3-year civil property dispute. He did not know that civil court was no longer a relevant venue. He did not know that Detective Miller had already secured the subpoena for the notary logbook. He did not know that my mother was officially disbarred. He did not know that the federal wire fraud indictments were currently being drafted by the state prosecutor to address the forged signature on the loan documents. Most importantly, he did not know that resting quietly inside the black leather briefcase at my feet was a freshly printed document provided directly by the Financial Crimes Unit. It was a document that would immediately and permanently terminate his ability to negotiate a financial settlement on their behalf. I let the silence stretch across the large room, allowing the weight of their anticipation to peak. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the cool air conditioning of the expensive law firm fill my lungs. The era of the reliable, silent daughter was officially over. The time for passive defense had expired. It was time to balance the ledger. I reached down and placed my briefcase onto the mahogany table. The heavy brass clasps echoed sharply as I unlatched them. I looked directly into my father's eyes, watching the manufactured confidence begin to fracture, and I pulled a single manila folder from the interior compartment. The conflict was about to shift from a theoretical civil threat to a catastrophic criminal reality. My family believed they could buy their way out of a felony, but they were about to discover the devastating cost of a verified mathematical truth. I placed the heavy manila folder flat on the polished mahogany surface. I did not shove it aggressively. I applied exactly enough kinetic force to glide the thick paper across the center divide, watching it come to a smooth, calculated stop directly in front of Marcus Vance. The defense attorney looked down at the closed cover. He possessed a master's degree in reading physical tells during high-stakes negotiations, and my complete lack of hesitation finally registered as a severe anomaly in his standard litigation playbook. He reached out and flipped the folder open. Inside lay a single stapled document. It was not a civil counteroffer designed to salvage family relations. It was not a desperate plea for a reduced financial settlement. It was a formal 14-page indictment recommendation drafted less than 2 hours ago by the Maryland State Attorney, heavily supported by the Financial Crimes Division. The top right corner featured the embossed, undeniable seal of the state prosecutor. Detective Miller had not merely secured a subpoena for my mother's notary logbook the previous evening. The raid on the suburban household had yielded catastrophic, undeniable results. The physical journal confirmed every single fraudulent entry. Worse, the state troopers discovered clumsy attempts to alter official state records using white correction fluid, prompting an immediate escalation of the charges based on a documented consciousness of guilt. Marcus Vance is a seasoned officer of the court who built his lucrative career defending wealthy executives and minor politicians. Men in his elite position do not risk their own prestigious legal licenses to protect arrogant clients who systematically lie to them about verifiable federal felonies. I watched his eyes scan the first dense paragraph. I saw the exact second his brain processed the specific statutory codes for federal wire fraud, systemic forgery, and elder financial exploitation. All the manufactured, robust color drained from his face, leaving a sickly pale hue behind his expensive designer frames. The profound silence in the room was abruptly shattered by a distinct, sharp scrape. Vance physically pushed his heavy leather chair backward, sliding his body a full inch away from my parents. It was an involuntary cellular retreat from a newly discovered highly toxic contagion. My father leaned forward, squinting at the dense legal text, entirely misinterpreting the dynamic shift occurring at his own table. He still believed I was operating within a defensive paradigm. He thought I had just served them with a massive civil lawsuit designed to bleed their remaining cash reserves. He opened his mouth to deliver another patronizing lecture about the immense cost of court battles. I preempted him completely. "You are fundamentally misunderstanding the current power structure of this room," I stated, keeping my vocal register perfectly flat and entirely devoid of emotional resonance. "I am not here to negotiate my inheritance. You are here to negotiate your prison sentences." The arrogant facade my parents had worn into the law firm disintegrated instantly. I directed my attention back to their attorney, outlining the precise legal reality they were facing. "The document you are currently reading details the verified findings of a multi-agency criminal task force," I explained to Vance, watching him digest the impossible variables. "Your clients did not merely forge a quitclaim deed to steal waterfront real estate. They utilized a permanently revoked notary commission to certify a fabricated property transfer, which constitutes systemic perjury. Furthermore, they committed identity theft across state lines to secure a $45,000 commercial loan, upgrading their initial liability to a strict federal jurisdiction." Vance looked at my mother. His expression had transformed from smug superiority to cold, furious, professional betrayal. Submitting a forged document to a civil judge under the pretense of validity could have cost him his entire career. "You told me the notary stamp was currently valid," he whispered, his voice vibrating with suppressed white-hot anger. "You told me the commercial loan was a simple misunderstanding regarding a standard cosigner agreement. You lied to me about the fundamental facts of an active federal investigation." I did not allow my parents any time to formulate a new defense or attempt another manipulation. I presented the final, inescapable calculus. "The state prosecutor possesses enough physical evidence to secure a mandatory minimum sentence for both of you." I continued my gaze, locking onto my parents' terrified faces. "However, I have quantified the inherent value of my own time. Sitting through a 2-year criminal trial represents an unacceptable drain on my professional resources and my psychological baseline. The state attorney has agreed to accept a binding plea arrangement contingent entirely upon my explicit recommendation for prosecutorial leniency." I laid out the strict, non-negotiable terms of their surrender. "First, you will sign a sworn, legally binding admission of guilt regarding both the forged property deed and the fraudulent commercial banking application. Second, you will permanently forfeit any current or future claim to the estate assets, removing yourselves entirely from the probate process and relinquishing the Chesapeake house. Finally, we address the outstanding debt," I announced, shifting my focus to the far end of the table. Harper had completely stopped tapping her phone against the wood. She was absolutely frozen, her breath caught shallowly in her throat.
Harper had never faced a genuine consequence in her 32 years of existence. Every failed business venture, every overdrawn credit card, and every ruined relationship was always quietly erased by our father's checkbook and our mother's aggressive social maneuvering. Now, facing a massive commercial banking institution backed by federal regulators, there was no checkbook large enough to orchestrate a rescue. "You committed corporate embezzlement against your former employer, Harper is," I stated clinically, dissecting her history without an ounce of pity. "Your parents committed federal wire fraud to shield you from the consequences of your own insolvency. That protective machinery is now permanently disabled. The third condition of this settlement requires you to assume full individual legal liability for the $45,000 loan. You will sign the commercial debt transfer paperwork today, legally binding yourself to the restitution, or the federal investigators will gladly expand their upcoming indictment to include you as a willing, active co-conspirator in the fraud." A sharp, ragged gasp escaped Harper's lips. The terrifying reality finally crashed over her insulated worldview. The protected golden child was entirely exposed to the brutal mechanisms of the real world. She looked desperately at our parents, waiting for them to intervene. She waited for our father to launch a defensive tirade or for our mother to formulate a brilliant, manipulative escape route to save her. But Richard and Diane were completely silent, paralyzed by the sudden crushing weight of their own massive criminal exposure. They could not save their favorite daughter because they could not even save themselves from the impending collapse. Marcus Vance closed the manila folder with a heavy, definitive thud. He did not look at my parents with any remaining shred of empathy or professional loyalty. He looked at them as massive liabilities threatening his firm's pristine reputation. He was no longer negotiating for their assets. He was frantically attempting to mitigate their immediate incarceration. "I strongly advise you to accept these terms right now," Vance instructed them, his tone completely stripped of its previous warmth and replaced with absolute chilling authority. "If you refuse this arrangement and attempt to fight this in court, I will formally withdraw as your legal counsel on the grounds of client deception. And when I walk out that door, the State Police Task Force will be waiting in the lobby downstairs to execute your arrest warrants before you even reach your vehicles." My father stared at the mahogany table, his chest heaving as the last vestige of his control evaporated. He slowly reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a silver fountain pen. The ultimate surrender had begun, but the true consequences of their actions had not yet fully materialized. As my father unscrewed the cap of the pen, Thomas Sterling leaned forward, sliding a secondary, much thicker stack of legally binding contracts across the table, introducing a catastrophic financial reality my parents had entirely failed to anticipate. The stack of contracts resting on the mahogany surface transformed the atmosphere inside the conference room into an unbreathable vacuum. The ambient noise from the central air conditioning system sounded deafening against the absolute silence of the defeated family sitting across from me. My father spent his entire adult life operating as a regional sales director for a Midwestern logistics corporation. His professional methodology relied exclusively on emotional manipulation and aggressive interpersonal charm. Whenever he missed a quarterly revenue quota, he would invite his superiors to a premium steakhouse, purchase expensive liquor, and weave elaborate tales about fictitious family hardships to secure deadline extensions. He survived for decades by weaponizing pity and avoiding accountability. Now facing the catastrophic reality of a federal prison sentence, he attempted to deploy that exact same tactic against his own offspring. He stared at the binding plea agreements, his facial muscles contorting into a mask of manufactured anguish. Meadow Richard croaked, allowing his vocal cords to waver with practiced distress. "You are completely destroying us. We provided you with a beautiful childhood. We funded your university tuition, and now you are sending your own flesh and blood to the slaughterhouse over a simple mistake. How can you possibly be this cold?" I evaluated the man who had secretly planned to let me take the fall for a massive corporate default. I did not raise my pitch or exhibit an ounce of reciprocal distress. "I did not forge those legal documents, Dad," I replied smoothly, delivering the statement with chilling precision. "I simply calculated the math.
The equation was definitively solved, and the inescapable reality of their predicament finally penetrated his stubborn psychological barriers. He reached out with trembling fingers, gripped the silver fountain pen resting on the table, and dragged the metal tip across the signature line of the primary forfeiture contract. The pen then passed to my mother. Diane had spent 3 decades meticulously constructing a flawless suburban facade. She served on the Neighborhood Homeowner Association board, organized extravagant charity galas, and utilized her former paralegal status to project an aura of unassailable intellectual authority. Her entire identity hinged on maintaining social superiority over her peers. As she looked down at the paper that officially confessed to elder exploitation and systemic perjury, that carefully curated identity shattered into microscopic pieces. Genuine tears began to spill over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive cosmetic application. She was not weeping out of remorse for stealing my grandmother's emergency medical savings. She was mourning the permanent destruction of her country club reputation. Once this document entered the public domain, she would become an outcast. Her wealthy friends would shun her. The entire subdivision would gossip endlessly about the disgraced legal professional who robbed her dying parent. Sobbing audibly into a tissue, Diane signed her name, officially relinquishing any current or future claim to the Chesapeake waterfront estate. The focus then shifted to the far edge of the table. The ultimate reckoning had finally arrived for the protected golden child. Thomas Sterling reached into his tailored suit jacket and extracted a small digital audio recorder. He placed the rectangular device squarely in the center of the polished wood surface and pressed the activation button. A tiny indicator light illuminated, signaling the microphone was currently capturing every single sound inside the soundproof room. Harper stared at the glowing indicator as if it were a venomous reptile preparing to strike. Throughout her entire adolescence and young adulthood, my sister had never once apologized for her destructive behavior. If she crashed a vehicle, our parents immediately purchased her a newer model. If she failed a collegiate course, they hired expensive tutors to complete her academic assignments. She existed in a perpetual state of insulated consequence avoidance, genuinely believing the rules of society did not apply to her. State law requires verbal confirmation when assuming a corporate debt liability of this magnitude. Thomas instructed, his voice radiating pure professional detachment. You must read the designated paragraph on page 4 aloud for the official legal record. Harper looked pleadingly at Marcus Vance. The high-priced defense attorney simply crossed his arms and offered zero assistance. He was entirely finished advocating for clients who had nearly destroyed his own lucrative practice through their blatant deception. With violently shaking hands, Harper picked up the dense financial document. Her voice, usually loud and incredibly demanding, was reduced to a pathetic, fractured whisper. "Speak clearly into the microphone," I commanded, refusing to allow her to mumble her way through the confession. Harper swallowed hard, her chest heaving with panic. "I, Harper Elise Jones, do hereby acknowledge and assume full individual legal responsibility for the $45,000 commercial loan initially drafted under false pretenses," she read, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks. "I release all other parties from any financial obligation regarding this specific lending agreement. I accept total liability for the principal balance, accrued interest, and associated penalty fees." The boulder finally landed with crushing force. By verbalizing the assumption of debt on a recorded channel and providing her physical signature, she legally surrendered every single avenue of attack they possessed against me. The banking institution would now pursue her exclusively. If she defaulted on the payment schedule, the federal financial regulators would gladly seize her personal assets. The corporate embezzlement she had committed was now firmly and permanently chained to her own ankles. Thomas stopped the recording device. He gathered the stack of signed contracts, tapped the edges against the table to align the pages perfectly, and retrieved his own official notary equipment from his briefcase. It was a moment of profound poetic justice. My mother watched in absolute, horrified silence as a legitimate, registered officer of the court finalized the documents that would guarantee her public disgrace. The heavy metal seal clamped down on the paper with a resounding, authoritative clack. The sound echoed through the room, finalizing the transaction and severing their control over my life forever. I did not offer any words of forgiveness. I did not express anger or residual resentment. Emotional outbursts are reserved for people who still require validation from their opponents. I required absolutely nothing from them ever again. I retrieved the legalized copies belonging to me. I placed the documents inside my black leather briefcase, ensuring the edges were perfectly smooth and unbent. I closed the lid, securing the brass latches with 2 decisive clicks. Without a single backward glance, I stood up from my chair, turned around, and walked toward the exit. Thomas followed closely behind me, carrying the evidence that guaranteed my permanent freedom. We rode the elevator down to the lobby in comfortable silence. When the polished metal doors parted, I stepped out into the bustling atrium of the commercial building. The afternoon sun was streaming through the massive glass windows, illuminating the imported marble floor. I will file the injunction dismissal and record the new property title before the courthouse closes today, Meadow Thomas stated, shaking my hand firmly near the exit. You executed that strategy flawlessly. I thanked him for his excellent representation and exited through the revolving doors onto the busy downtown sidewalk. I walked 1.5 blocks to the premium parking garage where I had left my sedan. The air felt incredibly light in my lungs. The oppressive psychological weight I had carried since my grandmother's funeral was entirely eradicated. However, the consequences of my sister's catastrophic financial reality were moving much faster than even my actuarial mind had calculated. As I approached the 3rd level of the concrete parking structure, I noticed a large, heavy-duty tow truck blocking the main driving lane. Its yellow warning lights were flashing rhythmically against the gray pillars. The operator was currently attaching thick steel chains to the front axle of a pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle. I recognized the customized license plate immediately. The vehicle belonged to Harper. While she was upstairs weeping into a microphone and assuming a massive federal bank debt, the universe was aggressively balancing her other outstanding ledgers. The retail boutique failure had triggered a massive cascade of secondary defaults. Her automotive lender had evidently issued a repossession order several weeks ago, and a dedicated skip tracer had finally located the vehicle parked in the downtown Annapolis commercial sector. I stood completely still in the shadows, watching the hydraulic lift elevate the front tires of my sister's prized automobile off the pavement. A profound sense of astonishment washed over me. The American financial system is a ruthless, highly efficient machine when an individual ceases to make their monthly payments. The protective bubble was not merely popped, it was being physically towed away in broad daylight. The truck operator secured the final safety strap, climbed into his cab, and drove the luxury vehicle down the concrete ramp, leaving behind an empty, oil-stained parking space. My sister was about to exit a traumatic legal negotiation, walk to this garage, and discover she had absolutely no way to drive herself home. I unlocked my modest, fully paid sedan, slid into the comfortable driver's seat, and started the engine. The narrative of my family was fundamentally resolved, but I still had one final destination to visit before the accounting could be officially closed forever. I inputted the coordinates for the Chesapeake waterfront property into my navigation unit, ready to physically claim the sanctuary that was now unequivocally mine. The weeks following the mediation session demonstrated the absolute efficiency of social consequences within a closed suburban ecosystem. The protective echo chamber my parents had meticulously maintained for 3 decades did not simply crack, it disintegrated entirely. Aunt Susan had not stopped at sending a single photograph of the ledger to the digital family network. Driven by a profound sense of righteous betrayal, she spent the subsequent days orchestrating a comprehensive informational campaign. She visited a commercial copy center and printed high-resolution duplicates of the entire blue accounting book. She mailed physical copies to every aunt, uncle, and cousin residing on the eastern seaboard. The suburban Maryland community where my parents resided operated on a strict hierarchy dictated by perceived wealth and moral superiority. Individuals maintained their status by projecting an image of flawless prosperity. Financial instability was considered a minor embarrassment, but stealing money from an elderly relative to fund luxury vacations was an unforgivable social felony. When the verified proof of their criminal behavior circulated through the extended family, the resulting isolation was immediate and absolute. My parents became social pariahs overnight. The invitations to neighborhood dinner parties completely stopped arriving. Their long-standing country club memberships were quietly but firmly revoked by the executive board, citing a vague violation of community standards. They could no longer attend local charity events or holiday gatherings without facing open hostility and disgusted stares from people they had previously considered their peers. Their primary currency was social influence, and that account was now permanently overdrawn. While my parents suffocated under the weight of their ruined public image, my older sister experienced a much more visceral form of poetic justice. Harper no longer possessed a luxury vehicle. The aggressive bank holding the corporate debt she had officially assumed during mediation immediately initiated collection protocols. The federal regulators secured a court order to garnish any future wages she earned. Stripped of her golden child status and completely cut off from the drained financial reserves of our parents, Harper was forced to enter the general labor market for the very first time. Harper had spent her entire adult life playing the role of a wealthy boutique owner. She possessed no practical skills, no college degree, and a resume consisting entirely of failed vanity projects subsidized by stolen money. The corporate sector rejected her applications immediately. She ultimately secured employment at a high-volume discount retail store located in a strip mall adjacent to an interstate highway. The woman who previously spent her afternoons sipping imported sparkling water while criticizing the fashion choices of her subordinates was now required to wear a rigid polyester uniform. She spent 8 hours a day standing on concrete floors unloading heavy cardboard boxes and folding inexpensive garments for demanding customers. The mathematics of her situation were brutally clear. Assuming a minimum wage salary and subtracting mandatory tax deductions and court-ordered wage garnishments, it would take her approximately 14 years of continuous, grueling manual labor to satisfy the $45,000 principal. The insulated fantasy world she had inhabited was replaced by the harsh, unyielding reality of the American working class. The systemic conflict remained dormant until the final Thursday of November. I spent the Thanksgiving holiday alone at the Chesapeake waterfront property. I had spent the preceding week systematically cleaning the house, removing the lingering odors of illness and neglect. The hardwood floors were polished, the broken fixtures were repaired, the sanctuary felt remarkably peaceful. The ambient temperature outside was cold, but the interior of the home was warm and filled with the scent of roasted vegetables and fresh bread. I was standing by the kitchen island watching the late afternoon sun reflect off the gray waters of the bay when my cellular device vibrated on the granite counter. I picked up the phone and looked at the illuminated screen. The notification indicated an incoming text message from my mother. I had not spoken to her since the day she signed the federal plea agreement in the downtown law office. The criminal proceedings were moving forward quietly through the state judicial system, completely detached from my daily existence. I unlocked the screen and read the short string of digital text. "We are eating alone today. I hope you are incredibly happy with what you have done to this family." The message was a perfectly constructed pebble, designed to create a massive ripple in my psychological pond. It was a targeted strike aimed directly at the residual conditioning installed during my childhood. For a brief, fractional moment, I felt a familiar ghost of guilt materialize in my chest. It was the old, predictable reflex of a compliant daughter trained to absorb the emotional distress of her parents. I pictured them, sitting in their silent, socially isolated dining room, eating a miserable meal while contemplating their impending prison sentences. Then my actuarial mind engaged, completely overriding the emotional programming. I analyzed the text message not as a communication of genuine sorrow, but as a deliberate transaction. My mother was not expressing remorse for her crimes. She was attempting to collect an unearned emotional debt. She wanted me to feel responsible for the miserable reality she had constructed with her own bare hands. She desperately needed to confirm that she still possessed the power to disrupt my peace, even from a considerable distance. The message was a pathetic, lingering grasp for control from a woman who had completely lost her entire kingdom. I did not type a response. Engaging with a manipulative entity, even to offer a rejection, simply validates their attempt at connection. It provides them with the emotional capital they are seeking. I pressed the digital icon adjacent to her name and selected the option to permanently block the contact. I repeated the exact same process for my father and my sister. I then deleted the message thread, watching the text vanish entirely into the digital void. The systemic conflict was finally and definitively severed. I placed the phone back onto the granite counter and walked toward the large glass windows facing the water. The bay was calm, the surface resembling a smooth sheet of dark glass under the fading autumn sky. The house was completely silent, but it was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a courtroom or an interrogation room. It was the clean, expansive silence of total autonomy. As I watched a single blue heron glide gracefully over the water, a surprising realization settled into my analytical mind, bringing the entire ordeal into perfect, astonishing clarity. The initial equation I had formulated months ago was fundamentally flawed. I had believed that securing the waterfront property and avoiding financial ruin was the ultimate victory. I had treated the house as the primary asset to be protected. The house was never the true asset. The true asset was the profound, unshakable boundary I had just constructed around my own existence. By forcing the American legal system to process their crimes, I had not merely defended my inheritance, I had successfully insulated my entire future from their chaos. They were trapped in a prison of their own design, paying restitution in minimum wage increments and facing state prosecutors, while I stood safely behind an impenetrable wall of verified truth and legal protection. The ledger was completely balanced, the accounts were closed, and for the first time in my 32 years of life, the mathematics of my future belonged exclusively to me. 6 months is a standard metric for measuring the stabilization of a newly implemented system. In the half year following the final mediation session, the chaotic variables of my previous existence were systematically replaced by absolute predictability. The transition did not occur instantaneously. Peace is not a sudden arrival. It is a slow, methodical construction project requiring immense discipline. I did not retain the Chesapeake waterfront property. While the structure represented a significant victory over the people who attempted to steal it, maintaining a massive luxury estate for a single occupant is mathematically inefficient. Furthermore, the physical space contained too many historical data points. Every room held a residual memory of my grandmother, but also the lingering shadows of my mother, measuring the drapes while the actual owner was dying upstairs. I required a sanctuary completely devoid of inherited trauma. Therefore, I engaged a reputable commercial real estate broker. We listed the colonial home during the peak spring buying season. Driven by a highly competitive local market, the property sold in 14 days to a young corporate executive. The final transaction closed 10% above the initial asking price. The substantial capital gained from that single sale fundamentally altered my baseline trajectory. I utilized a fraction of those liquid funds to purchase a modest, elegant townhome in a quiet, heavily forested community near Annapolis. The new residence features modern architecture, soundproofed walls, and a strict homeowner association that guarantees a meticulously maintained exterior. It is an environment engineered for absolute tranquility. There are no unexpected visitors. There are no sudden crises requiring immediate financial intervention. The airspace belongs entirely to me. However, adapting to this perfect silence introduced a new, complex internal conflict. American society operates on a deeply ingrained cultural narrative, dictating that biological relationships are inherently sacred. We are continuously conditioned by television programs, holiday marketing campaigns, and unsolicited advice from coworkers to believe that estrangement is a temporary failure requiring eventual forgiveness. Acknowledging that you are an orphan by choice violates that pervasive social contract. During the initial weeks in my new townhome, I experienced a specific heavy isolation. It was not regret, but rather the profound realization of my own absolute independence. When I filled out the intake forms for a new primary care physician, I had to leave the emergency contact section completely blank. There is a distinct psychological toll extracted when you permanently sever your foundational roots. You secure your safety, but you must simultaneously accept that you are operating entirely without a safety net. If I fall, nobody in my biological network will catch me. I spent considerable time analyzing this specific vulnerability. My actuarial training provided the necessary perspective. A safety net constructed from frayed, decaying rope is infinitely more dangerous than having no net at all. My family never functioned as a support system. They functioned as a parasitic organism, draining my resources to subsidize their own catastrophic decisions. Accepting the reality of my voluntary orphanhood was simply the cost of doing business with my own future. On a crisp Saturday morning in early May, the final confirmation of this transaction arrived. I was sitting on the private back porch of my townhome. The wooden deck overlooked a small, dense grove of oak trees. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine. I held a heavy blue ceramic mug in my hands. It was the only physical item I had retained from the Chesapeake estate. It was my grandmother's favorite coffee cup. The worn glaze against my palm served as a tactile reminder of the single relative who actually valued my existence. I placed the mug onto a small glass patio table and opened my digital tablet. Every Saturday, I perform a comprehensive review of my personal financial portfolio. It is a grounding exercise, a ritual of verified reality. I logged into my encrypted banking portal and watched the interface populate with current data. The numbers displayed across the screen were pristine. There were no joint checking accounts vulnerable to unauthorized withdrawals. There were no mysterious credit inquiries indicating a stolen identity. There were no fraudulent commercial loans attached to my Social Security number. I navigated to the investment section, noting the steady, predictable growth of my diversified index funds. The capital generated from the estate sale was securely allocated across multiple conservative asset classes, guaranteeing a comfortable, independent retirement decades ahead of schedule. The ledger was incredibly boring, and that boredom was the most exquisite luxury I had ever possessed. As I stared at the clean mathematical columns, a profound realization crystallized in my mind. It was the final boulder shifting into its permanent resting place. I reflected upon the initial ambush at my parents' dining room table, the exact moment this entire sequence of events began. I remembered sitting under the ornate chandelier, feeling the crushing weight of their coordinated attack. I recalled the terror of realizing they had engineered a massive debt and expected me to passively surrender my inheritance to save them. At that time, I believed they were building an inescapable trap. I thought they were constructing a cage designed to hold me captive for the remainder of my adult life. I was entirely incorrect. By attempting to steal my identity and drain my future, my parents had fundamentally miscalculated the resulting trajectory. They thought they were forcing me into submission. Instead, they had inadvertently handed me the exact tools required to dismantle their control. Their greed provided the legal justification. Their reckless forgery provided the criminal leverage. Their overwhelming arrogance forced me to abandon my lifelong habit of passive compliance and discover my own lethal efficiency. They did not trap me. They handed me the keys to my absolute freedom, and then they locked themselves inside the cage. My father is currently awaiting his formal sentencing hearing, his prestigious career reduced to a humiliating public scandal. My mother is facing the permanent destruction of her social standing and the terrifying reality of federal incarceration. My sister is spending her youth scanning barcodes in a fluorescent retail environment, her wages continuously drained to pay restitution for a crime she thought she could easily escape. They engineered their own exile, trapped in a mathematical equation of their own making, while I sit on a quiet porch drinking excellent coffee. The outcome is perfectly consistent with the fundamental logic of consequence. If you are listening to this narrative, you might recognize the subtle, familiar pressure of a toxic obligation in your own life. You might have a relative who uses biological connection as a weapon to extract resources, demand compliance, or invalidate your boundaries. Society will consistently encourage you to absorb their damage for the sake of maintaining a false harmony. You will be told that love requires infinite patience and endless financial or emotional subsidies. That is a catastrophic miscalculation. Family love should never require a balance sheet. A genuine relationship does not operate on a foundation of hidden ledgers, manufactured guilt, or systemic fraud. When the people assigned to protect you decide to treat your life as an expendable asset, you have absolutely no obligation to fund their deficit. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep an arsonist warm. Calculating the risk of leaving your foundational network is terrifying. The initial isolation is heavy. The social pressure to return to the familiar chaos will be immense. But when you apply a clinical objective lens to the relationship, the correct action becomes mathematically undeniable. Sometimes the most necessary response to systemic abuse is not a loud argument or a dramatic negotiation. Sometimes the bravest, most powerful thing a woman can do is simply recognize the deficit, close the account permanently, and walk away into a beautiful, quiet life they can never touch again. The dust has finally settled on the Jones family estate, but the echoes of their collapse continue to reverberate beyond the lawns of suburban Maryland. When we examine the spectacular wreckage of Richard, Diane, and Harper, we are not simply observing a true crime procedural or a localized instance of financial fraud. We are looking directly at a profound systemic failure of the American family blueprint. For generations, the traditional family structure has been culturally marketed as an unassailable sanctuary. It is sold to us as a secure foundation built on the implicit promises of unconditional love, mutual protection, and long-term guidance. We are taught that our parents are the ultimate architects of our moral compass, the guardians who will instill the virtues of honesty and fairness. Yet, as Meadow proved with her clinical precision, when the architects are corrupt, the foundation becomes an inescapable trap. Consider the specific parenting values Diane and Richard employed. On the surface, they performed the roles of successful American parents with award-winning precision. They provided a comfortable colonial home, funded university educations, and aggressively maintained a flawless country club facade. But their approach to raising children was inherently hollow, entirely devoid of genuine emotional awareness. They viewed their daughters not as independent human beings, but as living ledgers of their own social capital. Harper was designated as the golden investment, a localized proxy for their own fragile egos. She was the beautiful, demanding child, supposed to reflect their wealth back to the neighborhood. When Harper began to fail, when her superficial boutique collapsed into corporate embezzlement, true parenting would have required a massive, difficult intervention. Family responsibility dictates that we teach our children how to carry the weight of their own mistakes. Raising a functional adult requires the courage to let that child face the natural consequences of their reckless behavior. Instead of honesty, Richard and Diane chose aggressive insulation. Instead of fairness, they chose coordinated fraud. By secretly absorbing Harper's catastrophic debts and attempting to sacrifice their other daughter to cover the massive deficit, they violated the most sacred contract of parenthood. They believed they were protecting their favorite child. But shielding a child from the brutal mathematics of reality is not an act of love. It is an act of supreme sabotage. Harper never learned the concept of resilience because she was never allowed to fall. She was artificially inflated by stolen emergency medical funds and forged commercial loan documents unequipped for the inevitable moment when the protective bubble ruptured. Now stripped of her unearned status, she is folding cheap garments in a discount retail store, paying off a federal bank debt with minimum wage hours destroyed by the people who claim to love her most. This tragedy holds a heavy mirror up to a deeply uncomfortable aspect of American suburban culture. We are constantly pressured to maintain the image of the perfect family unit. We are trained to smile brightly in holiday photographs while silently absorbing the toxic behaviors of our relatives behind closed doors. We are conditioned to believe that keeping the peace is always more valuable than maintaining our personal integrity. But peace purchased with systemic manipulation and forged documents is simply a delayed, much more destructive war. When parents prioritize a carefully curated social image over fundamental fairness, they create an environment where emotional abuse thrives. They force the responsible, quiet child to become the permanent shock absorber for the reckless, favored child. Meadow was expected to quietly surrender her financial identity, her immaculate credit score, and her inheritance simply because she was the capable, compliant daughter. The traditional family structure is supposed to be a protective shelter, but without the pillars of absolute honesty and strict accountability, it rapidly devolves into a slaughterhouse for the compliant. The most profound lesson we can extract from Meadow's quiet victory is that true family love requires a perfectly balanced equation. Long-term guidance for a child cannot be built on a crumbling foundation of hidden accounting ledgers, backdated real estate deeds, or permanently revoked notary stamps. Raising a child to become a healthy member of society requires the agonizing discipline of letting them experience discomfort. It requires parents to possess the emotional intelligence necessary to admit their own flaws, rather than burning down the lives of their other children to hide their embarrassing mistakes. If Richard and Diane had simply possessed the basic moral courage to look Harper in the eyes and tell her no, they would not be facing mandatory federal prison sentences today. They willfully traded their physical freedom, their generational legacy, and their relationship with a brilliant daughter just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation about personal accountability. They chose the illusion of perfection over the reality of responsibility, and the universe aggressively balanced their ledger. We often navigate our own lives carrying the invisible ledgers handed down to us by our own parents. We spend decades trying to balance the outstanding debts of their unreasonable expectations, the inherited anxieties of their failures, and the silent, suffocating obligations that dictate our daily choices. We accept the roles assigned to us at the dinner table without ever calculating the actual cost of our compliance. If you find yourself analyzing the heavy cost of your own familial relationships, if you are drawn to stories that methodically dismantle the toxic facades we are all taught to relentlessly uphold, I strongly encourage you to follow the channel Morning Revenge. We consistently explore these complex narratives of personal justice and boundary setting, providing a quiet space for those who appreciate the immense power of finally walking away from a rigged game. There is profound, lasting comfort in realizing that you are not alone in recognizing the cold math behind the warm manipulation. As the chaotic narrative of the Jones family finally fades into the dusty archives of the state court system, it leaves behind a lingering, uncomfortable silence. It forces you to look closely at the invisible structures you have built in your own life. Look objectively at the people you defend, the dark secrets you keep to maintain the holiday peace, and the heavy, unfair burdens you willingly carry to protect the pristine image of your own household. We all desperately want to believe we are the architects of a safe, loving, and fair family environment, but mathematical equations do not lie, and eventual reckonings are never as far away as we hope. The heavy accounting ledger is always waiting on the table. The silver fountain pen is always full of ink. The final, undeniable balance is entirely up to you. You have to look in the mirror and ask yourself, when the inevitable audit finally comes to your front door, what exactly will it reveal about the house you call home?